what we do at the very beginning when we teach cultivating emotional balance courses together. We start with a definition of the emotion and a discussion of the function of the emotion. So how would you define shame?
Yeah, it's actually been a bit of an easier job since 2014. So that's when Brene Brown's YouTube video kind of went viral. I think I received it at least a dozen times over the course of a month. And it was great because prior teaching cultivating emotional balance, shame was an emotion that people really struggled with, especially struggling to disambiguate between guilt or regret or overall feelings of anxiety and fear. And it certainly is an emotion that's well studied in developmental psychology, meaning our very early part of life, that point around 4 or 5 years old when we start to recognize that others are thinking different than us, and we gain an ability to both have true empathy and shame. The simple definition that my dad, Dr. Paul Ekman, and a number of other psychologists rely upon is shame is really a feeling that there's something fundamentally wrong about you, something that if it was discovered, people wouldn't like you, people might even feel disgusted by you. And with that, it's a real identification with this idea of what's wrong about us. So the simple distinction between that and guilt is I did something wrong. And I also don't want someone to find out. And I also don't feel that great, but there's a stronger identification when we're thinking about shame, not just I did something wrong and bad, but fundamentally I am wrong and bad.
In terms of shame, we often say that these emotions that are universal always have a function. So shame is such a difficult emotion to feel and so unwanted for us. It might be hard for us to relate to the fact that shame might have a function. So I'd love to talk about that a little bit. What's the function of shame?
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting. Brene is making the idea so relatable and literally so relational. So how does shame interact with the thing we care about most in our life, which is, being with others and how to achieve that. So when we think of shame and we also think of guilt and we also think of empathy, these are what are called self-conscious emotions. So I can be angry at, this mug of water. If it's spilled, I'd be like, oh, why did you? But with shame, it's really related. So that's an emotion we can feel towards anything. But an emotion like shame and guilt and empathy implicitly and explicitly involve another person and involve our experience of how do we relate to our tribe? How does our tribe relate to us? And the function or utility is how do we keep our social tribes coherent? How do we make people feel in this very unfortunate way that we live in North America and across many parts of the world, we incarcerate people when they do wrong. We put them somewhere else and we lock them up. Not a possibility when we rely upon every member of our tribe to survive. So then what do? Well, we kind of psychologically imprison them. We make them feel bad by shaming them.
Yeah.
However, in our enormously individualized society and context in most of the modern world, that shame is something we hold alone and that we're not able to reintegrate in that communal way that historically, my guess, looking at our indigenous tribes that are still kind of showing us the way that we all used to live, that there is this kind of group shaming and then group reintegrating.
So there's a psychotherapist and compassion teacher, Paul Gilbert, who's written a lot of books, and I love his work. And last year, right after the beginning of the pandemic, he released this whole series of videos that he was trying to help people manage, what was going on and increase their compassion, increase their self-compassion, this beautiful series that he made freely available. And in one of them, he was explaining what he called the evolution of self-criticism. And it feels like it relates to what you just said. Self-criticism evolved to determine our place in the hierarchy, to avoid shame attacks from others, right? So like you were just saying, our tribal past where we only related to maybe, they estimate 100 or 150 people in our lifetime, like we had this kind of closed system. our self-monitoring really of where are we in that hierarchy. And then you figured it out and you didn't have to do it constantly. But for us now, we're having to do it all the time because we're in these complex social situations. So what started as adaptive and functional now is on overdrive.
This developed sense of self-monitoring. Who am I in relation to this? Who am I in relation to that? Are they better? Are they worse? Are they the same? Right? And that constant evaluation, which, we will, I'm sure, get into soon, Tenzin, but that's really related also to contempt.
Yes.
And what Paul Gilbert also talks about is our underdeveloped drive, which is self-soothing. So we're very good at monitoring and criticism, and yet our capacity to self-soothe has been deeply compromised.
You say guilt can be a productive moral emotion. And you say it sounds kind of weird, but what we try and do is move people from shame to guilt as a road to repair. And I'd love for you to say more about, because sometimes we think, wait a minute, we want to move people to guilt? That seems weird, but moving from shame to guilt is a more productive moral emotion and a way to repair.
Many people experience shame from addiction, from prior abuse, from behaviors that they believe were abusive or harmful to others. And so wanting to honor that. I'm not talking about that in this moment, because here we are. It's a little early in the day for that for us. And
we're going to get there in another question or two. So.
And, given the online context of training and teaching, we recognize that shame is hard for folks, and we don't want you to kind of peel open the deepest layers while not being held in true live community. Yeah. So with that caveat, like, how do we move people towards guilt from shame is honestly increasing our self-awareness and our insight. So when we feel completely plagued by shame, even if we are and have committed an act that is harmful, that has hurt others, even if we are acting in ways that is harmful towards ourselves through addiction, fusing that with who we are ignores our basic goodness, right? And this is where Buddhism and psychology so beautifully can support one another. Because psychologically, I can tell you why none of that is true. But through the cultivation of knowing our inner goodness, that is actually the way we can start to meet those feelings and transform them. Because the knowledge only gets you so far, right? It's important and useful to identify. And yet we need to have that felt experience, kind of forging the inner pathways, as my teacher, Jennifer Wellwood, talks about a lot, so that we can face that.
One thing you mentioned just now was, kind of getting into trauma. And I know we've both been engaging in the work of Resmaa Menakem. And in fact, you did this brilliant interview in the kind of 20th anniversary of the Mind and Life Destructive Emotions series that was just amazing. And in his work, he really focuses on the somatic experience of trauma, specifically of racialized trauma. And, for me, when I think of his work that I've been engaging in, I think there's a strong somatic component to shame that might relate also to trauma.
John Wellwood, who coined the term spiritual bypass, one of the other terms he uses is premature transcendence.
Ah, nice. Wow.
And there's a lot of that, right? It's like, I'm just going to go up and out to that place where it's nice. and not learn to tolerate somatically the challenge. And one thing, Resmaa Menakem, who does work on somatic abolitionism, meaning how do we manage a lot of the shame, a lot of the guilt, a lot of the discomfort of recognizing what many of us, let's just say most white folks living anywhere that isn't completely white, so everywhere and anyone, are inadvertently creating harm. And we hear that. And, for some of you on the call, you might have been doing this work for a while and it's a bit more familiar. But when that is especially first kind of made clear, I think that there is a somatic experience of either wanting to run away or to fight, depending on your specific strategy of choice. And what Resmaa encourages us is not to stop feeling that way, but how do we metabolize that pain in the body? not in the mind, because we're so conceptually oriented of, well, I'm going to, combat racism by donating money to great causes. Awesome. I'm going to really become aware of maybe implicit biases. Awesome. And what he emphasizes, and is true from what we know of literature on embodied emotional awareness or interoception, is we also need to learn how to sit with the discomfort. Otherwise, we're going to be inadvertently perpetuating it by trying to escape from it.
It reminds me of a program that I used to do with people experiencing incarceration, and it was a year-long anger management, violence prevention program. And a big part of that program was exactly what you're talking about, like teaching people ways to just be with all of their experience. In that class, it was amazing. It was about 26 men. It was in a men's prison, all of whom, we did these sort of surveys at the beginning as we were starting the work, and all of them had experienced sexual, physical, 100% emotional assaults as children, like so much trauma from childhood, so much shame about the offense that had gotten them into prison. And, realizing too, this connection between, I think, trauma and shame and other emotions too. And you and I have talked about sometimes shame is fundamental. And then there's a lot of acting out that comes out of shame, like anger and violence that come from shame. And then, of course, we can feel shame about other emotions that we have. So the anger can be first, and then we feel shame about being angry, or the other way around. And yeah, any insights into shame is either kind of a more fundamental emotion or a secondary emotion?
You're not wrong, but there's more.
Okay.
Emotions are temporary. Emotions are triggered in a 25th of a second and last usually no longer than 30 seconds, sometimes 90 seconds. Most of us experience shame as something that feels very ongoing. So we are consistently re-triggering. And that we're getting actually more into the territory of, habits and beliefs as opposed to emotions. Emotions really are it's like the fruit of that thinking, of that limited self-view. And so I think, again, of self-criticism, that's really the territory. If that is where we're always landing as kind of a cognitive, ruminative cycle, a lot of shame is going to manifest.
Yeah.
So I think working with those underlying, especially self-limiting beliefs is so fundamental.